1 gram per pound ideal body weight. So I'm 110 pounds. That's 110 grams of protein.
Not that hard to do.
It's not that hard. Not that hard to do. And then people can decide if they want carbohydrates or fats after that.
Based upon their activity level,
Exactly.
their body composition goals, all of that.
Based upon their activity level, based upon are they, insulin sensitive? Can they tolerate carbohydrates? Are they training?
Really important.
Yeah. The capacity to store protein really doesn't exist other than the amino acid reservoir in our muscles. Can you go through periods of protein restriction? You can, and we'll talk about that. But for me, the 1 gram per pound ideal body weight is a daily thing. That's not to say that an individual couldn't go through a period of time, say 4 days, for protein restriction. I think that we may find evidence that that is beneficial at some point. And when I say protein restriction, what kind of protein am I really targeting? I'm really targeting the methionine and the sulfur amino acids, which are just a section, a kind of amino acid, which I think is where Longo's work comes in these protein restriction camps. But I don't think it's a lifestyle. I mean, you're talking about very targeted, specific times.
And this would be a cyclical thing as to induce autophagy or something like that?
Yes, it's stress. So it's, for the science nerds out there, it's the integrated stress response.
Today's show with Dr. Gabrielle Lyon is brought to you by Myoscience Nutrition. As you can tell, we're talking a lot about the importance of skeletal muscle, the importance of having adequate muscle mass for longevity, the many roles that muscle plays when it comes to overall health. And one way to support muscle is by way of exercise, friends. I can't say this enough, but there's a natural product, a natural supplement that is legal and very effective for helping to optimize muscle when you're exercising. That's called creatine. We're going to talk about creatine later in this episode. In fact, scientific studies show that when you pair creatine with electrolytes, you get a synergistic benefit. So that's why we created over at Myoscience the electrolyte sticks that are one of the only electrolytes out there that feature red mineral salt, albion chelated minerals, and therapeutic dosages, as well as creatine and taurine to help you recover and have amazing workouts. So you can read some of the 330 plus reviews over on our website, myoscience.com. You can save using the code podcast at checkout. There's now 2 flavors. You have the lemon lime flavor that tastes phenomenal, as well as the original orange flavor and an unflavored that is coming very soon. So again, to save on a very novel pre, post, and intra-workout formulation that is featuring both electrolytes and creatine, a carnonutrient to support your muscle health, you can use the code podcast at myoscience.com. That's MYOXCIENCE.com, Myoscience with an X. And let's cut back to it with Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. So Gabrielle, it's great to be back with you again. So we've talked a lot before about muscle protein synthesis, the importance of protein, that muscle is an organ linked with longevity and all of that. And I think there are some lingering questions for a lot of people, particularly as it relates to, this is a personal question that I sort of struggle with. We know that muscle is so important for aging and keeping us out of elderly homes and living independently. But then there's this whole side of like mTOR overexpression, cancer, chronic disease, right? So how do we grapple with that? I know you probably think about this and talk to patients about this a lot.
Yeah. We
want to maintain our muscle mass, but at the same time, some people are worried about fueling cancer potentially with the protein or the whatever. So let's sort of talk about how you think about this.
First of all, I really appreciate that question. And the question comes, kind of in 2 veins is where I'm hearing it. The first one is from a longevity perspective, because a lot of individuals in the space are saying, protein restriction is the way to go as it relates to longevity. Now, I would like to highlight that that's probably only 5 people.
Yeah.
And there is a whole other group of individuals who are either trained geriatricians like myself or experts in sarcopenia and aging that would all agree that dietary protein and muscle are critical, not important, but actually critical factors for longevity and aging. And then you bring up the second part of that question, which is how do we understand the concept of mTOR and cancer, longevity, and chronic mTOR overexpression. Mm-hmm. First thing that's really important to do is what is mTOR? And I know that your audience probably knows what mTOR is. It's a mechanistic target of rapamycin. And its purpose is really growth promotion. So not growth initiation. I know that you had mentioned cancer. And cancer is a disease of the genome. And when we think about a disease of the genome, a growth promoter wouldn't cause cancer. Just mechanistically, it's not the way that it actually works. Mm. So the concept of dampening mTOR, which again is this growth promoter and really critical for muscle protein synthesis, doesn't make any sense as it relates to longevity, especially as it relates to muscle. And you're probably thinking, well, how is that possible? Everybody is saying reduce dietary protein. Where is mTOR? So mechanistic target of rapamycin is part of this pathway for growth. It's in actually every tissue. It's in the brain, it's in the pancreas, it's in the liver, and it's in the muscle. mTOR is exquisitely sensitive to amino acids in skeletal muscle. Different than it is in the pancreas and the liver. And you're thinking, okay, well, what are some of the things that stimulate mTOR overall? And that is glucose, insulin, excess calories, and protein. However, for whatever reason, individuals are looking at the amino acid component, the stimulation of mTOR from leucine, as for whatever that target for mTOR stimulation and propagation. But I just mentioned that mTOR is actually stimulated by multiple other modalities, multiple other factors like insulin, excess energy, and also even exercise. Mm-hmm. But we really have to put this all in context. And when individuals are saying, well, we need to decrease mTOR stimulation, which again is just one singular pathway, because they are concerned about cancer promotion, we really have to take a step back. And we have to think, okay, well, number one, what is cancer? And we know cancer is a disease of the genome. And number two, what is one of the biggest risk factors of cancer? And that's obesity. And then number three, what is one critical factor in the survivability of all cancers? Do you know what that is?
I would think age, but maybe muscle mass.
It's muscle.
Guessing. Okay.
It's muscle. Irrespective of the kind of cancer. That's very important. It doesn't matter what kind of cancer an individual has, their survivability is increased with their muscle mass. So their capacity to survive cancer is directly related to their muscle.
Very important point.
So the other part, really important. Okay, so now, and we're going to get to the question, why has mTOR been targeted as it relates to dietary protein, which I think is a really important conversation. But if people truly care about mTOR stimulation, and there is this fundamental belief that this mechanism is going to decrease longevity, then we have to think of the other ways in which mTOR is stimulated, and that's excess insulin, excess calories. Mm-hmm. To me, that would be chronic overfeeding of higher carbohydrate foods, not discrete meals of dietary protein. I can appreciate, and I think everybody can appreciate, this overstimulation of, if someone has cancer, perpetuating a growth state could potentially be a problem. But again, prevention of cancer, propagation of cancer, these are all different things, all wrapped up into one conversation of mTOR.
Right. So I think it's important. We know this, like, as people who read research and things like that, but if you were to go have a Slurpee from 7-Eleven or go drink a soda, you're going to raise glucose and therefore insulin, and you will stimulate this growth factor.
You
this
will stimulate mTOR, exactly.
So yeah, I think epidemiologically, we would see like bodybuilders and athletes would have a disproportionately higher prevalence of cancer if, in fact, this connection between dietary protein and mTOR and cancer was there was a stronger correlation there, right? Because some bodybuilders are eating 400 grams of protein per day. To the best of my knowledge, there's not a higher prevalence of cancer in that subset of the population. So what I think it's important for people to recognize is it's not just protein that is stimulating this so-called, this mechanistic link associated with cancer and accelerated aging, the overexpression of mTOR by way of increasing too many calories, chronic feeding, snacking.
Yeah, but it doesn't. You're exactly right, and it doesn't make any sense to pin that on dietary protein and to pin that on amino acids. It doesn't make sense. And then the next question is, if dietary protein causes cancer, we should be able to say this is the mechanism that in human trials we've been able to show that this research works, not taking mechanistic data. There was one paper in 2014 that, maybe it was 2016, that really did a disservice that it's going to take 2 decades to undo. And that was a paper by Levine, and I think that was Walter Longo's group. And by the way, these are fine scientists. Mm-hmm. But the reality is it was published in Cell, and Cell at the time was a newer journal, and it's not a nutrition-based journal, right? So it's basic science, which is very valuable, right? It's like the Super Bowl. Yeah. However, what happened was they took NHANES data, which is the largest data set. They pulled certain data sets. They looked at mechanism, and then they said, okay, well, protein, cancer, IGF-1, this is the cause, dietary protein. And obviously the protein experts were came back and said, okay, you're recommending now below the RDA. So you're saying that individuals, so the RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram. You're now recommending people should eat what? 0.3 grams per kilogram, right? And we know that the RDA is the bare minimum to prevent deficiencies. Mm-hmm. So this paper really did a disservice in the way that it created associations. And of course, media picked it up and it was this whole boom. But the reality is, all the protein experts, not all, that's a bit cheeky, many of the world-leading protein experts, one including my mentor, Dr. Donald Layman, Stu Phillips, Doug Patton-Jones, Heather Leidy, these individuals that have been in the space for over 2 decades, said, listen, the way in which this paper was done, we've run it through professional statisticians who are familiar and work with NHANES data, and the correlations and the associations that you've put are inaccurate. Like, they're just wrong. And Cell never published this. Mm-hmm. And, the question is why? And, maybe it was perhaps that some of the authors were on the editorial board. Nobody will know. And I strongly encourage that individuals go look for this data in this letter to the editor. But it's really critical to understand that when something like that comes out, it does a true disservice and it really confuses people. Mm-hmm. And that is what I think happened. And listen, it's no different than what happened with cholesterol.
Same, yeah.
Right? Which, by the way, was taken out of the guidelines in 2015. Mm-hmm. But so these things it all becomes a narrative, and then the question becomes, who stands to benefit?
It's tough. And that paper was cited, I think, 2,000 times, and so it's considered a high impact paper. A lot of people are referencing that.
So you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I mean, that episode you did with Stu was amazing. And then he, I think, is doing subsequent follow-up research with a larger cohort to be able to further tease out this purported connection with protein intake and cancer. I don't know where that stands. Have you talked to him recently?
I don't know if it's been published yet. I'm sure I would have heard about it. So it hasn't been published yet. But again, these are really critical questions. So does dietary protein we're talking about cause cancer? Absolutely not. And I would say that the individuals within that space would also agree. Again, if individuals are going to say, okay, well, it's this pathway, mTOR, then stop overeating carbohydrates and stop having excess calories. And pancreas, liver, and muscle are all different.
That's a really good point. And I think one aspect of that paper, they were highlighting a link, not to deviate off mTOR too much, but IGF-1 is talked about a lot. And that IGF-1 overexpression is also linked with increased growth and potentially causing cancer. But there's this interesting connection with IGF-1, and there's an age association, and it's sort of like a U-shaped curve. After 65, higher IGF-1 levels, and that's sort of how you introduce this conversation, saying when we get older, muscle is so important for health, that higher IGF-1 is linked with lower cause of excess, I think it was all-cause mortality. And that's been shown, even Walter Longo recently published a paper on that. So how do you explain that to people? Because that's another concern. I don't know if the activists are still talking about IGF-1 as much as they used to, but it seems like that's related to mTOR and growth and cancer. So
yeah, how I think about it is I think that there are the obvious things that relate to cancer and disease, right? And that is obesity and muscle. And then there are the more subtle aspects where people are questioning whether it's, mechanistic target of rapamycin, or should we induce autophagy, or do we need to worry about IGF-1? And I think that those are all distractions from the obvious picture of skeletal muscle is critical as an organ system. And it's been decades overlooked and underappreciated. And obesity, we have a massive, massive problem. And I hate to use the word obesity epidemic, because an epidemic kills people slowly, right? But if we call it an obesity epidemic, then no one has to do anything about it. And we can just still talk about how it just exists without input from an obesogenic environment, without input from big, companies that perhaps push these
hyperpalatable foods
to us. Yeah. So, if someone were to ask me, am I concerned about elevated levels of IGF-1? I would say, well, listen, IGF-1 is highest when people are young. And if that were true, then probably all the younger individuals with robust IGF-1s would have cancer. And we don't see that.
Right. It's more of an age association. Interestingly, though, exercise increases IGF-1. IGF-1 is needed for creating memories in the brain and so forth. So there's all these beneficial aspects. So it's funny how we fall into these tribalistic camps, and it's like this binary thinking where this is good, this is bad, and protein increases IGF-1 cancer, therefore it's bad. But when you understand the nuances and the details and these sort of the context, and I think this is also an important point when we talk about protein, is people's like fitness state. Like, are they lifting weights? Are they doing things? You know, I see some people who are going on a carnivore diet and they don't even exercise, and they're having like 3 ribeye steaks a day. And I'm not saying that's going to be problematic, but I think context really matters, and that sort of gets lost. And that's why I like your content, to help people think a little bit more differently about these things. So you mentioned the suggestion to lower the RDA target of protein. Where should most people who are trying to stay healthy, what's the sweet spot in terms of like preventing obesity?
Another great question, and super practical for the listener. The current RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram. And that is, that really actually hasn't changed for the last 30 years. And if you think about that just in perspective of all the other recommendations that have changed or that we've talked about, whether it's fat or carbohydrates, cholesterol, these things have all changed. But protein, this lowly macronutrient that is arguably the most important macronutrient, right? The most important essential macronutrient, the recommendations have not changed. That's wild. And that 0.8 gram per kilogram, which is the current recommendation, is based on nitrogen balance studies, which is simply the way in which they determine growth, right? For 18, originally it was animal husbandry. What was the cheapest way to feed animals to give them the least amount of protein, the highest amount of carbs, and still get growth? And so they extrapolated that out and utilized that to look at nitrogen balance for 18-year-old men, soldiers. It was really around World War II, where the concept and the perception of protein in terms of how it can help people really was established, although even before that. So my recommendation, and the literature supports that at least double that. And that could be 1.6 grams per kilogram would be more optimal. And me personally, I recommend 1 gram per pound ideal body weight. That is on the higher end, but I believe that I can justify why that would be. 1 gram per pound ideal body weight, so I'm 110 pounds. That's 110 grams of protein.
Not that hard to do.
It's not that hard. Not that hard to do. And then people can decide if they want carbohydrates or fats after that.
Based upon their activity level, their body composition goals, all of that.
Based upon their activity level, based upon, are they, insulin sensitive? Can they tolerate carbohydrates? Are they training?
Really important.
Yeah.
Now this 110 grams for you.
Yeah.
You travel a lot,
but
you're a mom, you're busy. Like, is this an everyday thing, or do we sort of think about this like over the course of a week? What do you think?
Yeah. Another great question. I think about it in terms of every day. Protein, the capacity to store protein really doesn't exist other than the amino acid reservoir in our muscles. But it's interesting, when you think about the essential amino acids, you do need to have those. Can you go through periods of protein restriction? You can, and we'll talk about that. But for me, the 1 gram per pound ideal body weight is a daily thing. That's not to say that an individual couldn't go through a period of time, say 4 days, for protein restriction. I think that we may find evidence that that is beneficial at some point. And when I say protein restriction, what kind of protein am I really targeting? I'm really targeting the methionine and the sulfur amino acids, which are just a section, kind of amino acid, which I think is where Longo's work comes in, and these protein restriction camps. But I don't think it's a lifestyle. I mean, you're talking about very targeted, specific times.
And this would be a cyclical thing, as to induce autophagy or something like that?
Yes, as stress. So it's, for the science nerds out there, it's the integrated stress response.
Okay.
So
those sulfur amino acids trigger stress?
Yes. So the imbalance of the amino acids and the restriction of some of them, it does trigger a stress response, which is good.
Like a favorable thing.
A favorable thing. Like, I know that you talk about hormesis and ways in which the body can upregulate itself for autophagy, which you said, I use that word very loosely. And these are ways in which you can utilize a cyclical eating pattern. Now, who's this not for? That is not for an aging individual. It is not for someone who is sedentary. And when I say aging, that could be variable. What age is that? I would say aging is really when all your hormones are decreasing. And that's different for anybody. But certainly in your 60s, you should not be doing fasting, and you should not be doing protein restriction. That is a huge mistake. And why is it a huge mistake? Well, number one, muscle is the organ of longevity. and you have to protect it at all costs. It doesn't get easier. Listen, I wish protecting muscle was just as easy as gaining body fat, but it's not. And we have to really account for the world in which we live in. So it's critical.
That is so fascinating. Yeah, you're influencing my perspectives because in my eyes, the risk of cancer is a little bit high. You know,
right.
The risk increases with age, but then there is this counterbalance of like, well, you're already catabolizing muscle at a faster rate. It's harder to put on muscle. Yeah. So I love that perspective and that association with IGF-1 and all this. Really interesting.
Yeah. And what are the other things that we could think of? If people are really concerned about cancer, you know, then they should be really proactive about it. There are full body scans, there's a Gallery test, there's there's not genetic testing, well, there is genetic testing, but there's also early detection methylated strains, DNA strains that you can look at.
Yeah.
But again, cancer, you know, muscle mass, these things, muscle is critical.
Mm-hmm. That's such an important point. I know I wanted to get here a little bit later, but I think assessing muscle, you've talked a lot about this, and I think you've really helped people conceptualize and think about, okay, we have body fat analysis, we have BMI.
Yeah.
But clinically, there's not really good ways.
We've done a terrible job. And I've actually been poring over the literature on this because, and you know, a colleague of mine who is here now, you'll meet Dr. Alexis Cowan, who went to Princeton, and she was out of Rabinowitz's lab, which is an amazing lab. You know, we've been poring over this data, and what do we have, right? So we've got these cohort studies, you know, we have epidemiology, and nobody can identify what the optimal muscle mass is, or at least not well. And are you ready for why? So how do we look at muscle mass? We look at, are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
Okay, well, get ready, because I'm super pumped about it.
Nice.
We have talked a lot about lean body mass. That in the literature, it doesn't, when people talk about lean body mass, the majority of individuals that are reading the research and in the literature, they equate that to like skeletal muscle. Would you agree with that?
Right.
When people think about lean body mass, they are thinking, okay, well, then this is like a skeletal muscle thing. Lean body mass is not a good marker of skeletal muscle. Lean body mass includes total body water, includes blood, it includes everything other than fat tissue.
Even bone would be characterized as...
Yeah, so now you're looking at lean body mass and then fat. Well, in the literature, that's a huge problem because we've actually not had any, I don't want to say valuable, but consistent way to actually look at skeletal muscle.
Right.
So these studies, and when we talk about sarcopenia, people, and why is this a problem? This is a problem because in the geriatric community and in a lot of the literature, people will say sarcopenia is a decrease in muscle mass. And then now it's like, is it a muscle mass and then muscle function? In the literature, one would, from reading it, you would think, okay, people will say muscle mass doesn't necessarily matter. It's all about performance. So it's not the amount of tissue that you have, but it's actually the functionality. Well, the reason that this is wrong is because we just haven't had a good way of identifying skeletal muscle. So what does that mean? That means that up until recently, we now have some tools. So there's a way in which they look at, and I haven't done this, right? So they're starting to do this in my former lab at WashU, but they're looking at creatine, and people are ingesting a D3 creatine, and then they're urinating creatinine out, and then they're determining that this is the actual equivalent to muscle mass, so skeletal muscle. So one of the reasons why there's such a disconnect is because we haven't been able to identify skeletal muscle appropriately and consistently. And, it's a very difficult tissue. But this is why I think it's grossly overlooked, because everyone's talking about lean body mass. And you can have changes in lean body mass, and it doesn't necessarily correlate to improved gait speed or improved performance. But it does when you look at muscle. And one more thing.
Yeah, I love it.
Adipose tissue. So, and who's really pioneered this is a guy named Dr. William Evans. And he coined this term sarcopenia. And, he kind of, I wouldn't say that he coined the term sarcopenia, but he really laid it on the table for the rest of the individuals that are interested in the aging population. One of the things that's so important is that when he looked at the data, it's fat mass didn't matter related to performance, but skeletal mass did. Yet here we are always talking about adiposity. And actually that had no impact on performances that we think about when it comes to survivability, like gait speed, sit and stand test, things that we measure, grip strength.
And these are things that you measured as a geriatrician, right?
Yeah, we measured all that, yeah.
And would that be standard? Like if someone was 77 and they're like, family's worried about Alzheimer's or something, these are tests that are...
A geriatrician would measure this, yes.
Okay.
But we wouldn't necessarily, what are the ways to measure skeletal muscle? You can do a CT. No one's going to do that. You can do an MRI. Who's going to pay for that? You can do an in-body, okay, right? So bioimpedance. Or there's this potential new way of looking at things, which is, again, this creatine and creatinine.
That's cool.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if it correlates. It's not being done in clinical practice yet. It's still just being used in research. But again, one of the reasons why I think we've really missed the importance of skeletal muscle is we haven't had a good way of consistently measuring it. Because you can, let's say, even if we look at the mass of the skeletal muscle, we can't identify the quality of the tissue, right? And we know that fat can infiltrate the tissue. There's a decrease in flux, meaning, you get not just triglycerides, but you get these fatty acid, ceramides, diacylglycerol. And again, these are very complex. It depends on where it is in the tissue. It depends on if you're very active, you probably have a frequent flux. So your tissue doesn't look like a marbled steak over a period of time. So that is really important to understand. I think if someone is really interested, they could look at an appendicular skeletal mass index, which they can Google it. There's multiple papers that look at it, but it's not going to give you an optimal range. So
if you had your druthers and you could create a test, I think this is a little bit more... It more powerfully influences lifestyle change. So you tell someone, oh, you're overweight, you have too much fat. It's like, yeah, I need to lose fat, I need to diet, I need to go on the treadmill, I need to do all this. All those things also generally they come at the expense of losing muscle mass and so on. So if you tell people you're under muscled, when you improve your muscle mass, as you've talked about, you're increasing your resting metabolic rate, you're getting stronger, you're becoming more insulin sensitive.
Absolutely.
So I think it's a more proactive way of...
It's the only way.
Yeah.
And also, if we can address it now, then all these diseases of aging, listen, it's like, when I think about, because I treat patients in my clinic, and I think about all the drugs that we can use to treat diabetes and obesity. That's just treating, none of that is targeted towards muscle, by the way. And if someone were to say, okay, well, I want to treat your muscle, dude, the FDA would close you down.
Yeah.
Or whatever the medical board would close you down. You can't treat muscle other than testosterone. Maybe there's some indications for some of these other things like nandrolone and oxandrolone for skeletal muscle. But again, a physician would have to be very much able to answer the question as to why, and it has to be within a scope of practice. So again, this just highlights how backwards we are. We are so fixated on adiposity. That is absolutely a symptom of impaired muscle. I don't care... even we have obesity week. We don't have muscle week.
Good point.
But the issue is, if we care about root cause medicine, we cannot care about obesity. That is absolutely like an endpoint. Skeletal muscle insulin resistance, and I hope I'm not going on a bit of a tangent, but everybody knows about insulin resistance. And this is kind of the thing that everybody wants to protect themselves against. And insulin resistance, there's multiple ways to become insulin resistant. However, when I recently wrote a book, and I'm working on a white paper, and one of the things that I was examining is the models of obesity. And we know they are calories in, calories out, and then this insulin carbohydrate model of obesity. Now, have you ever looked in depth at any of those models?
I've read the back and forth with Kevin Hall and Ludwig and everything. It's quite interesting.
Okay. But myself, I have read this as well, and muscle is completely missing from the picture.
That's a good point.
So where is the muscle-centric model of obesity? All of a sudden, insulin resistance just happens like magic, and then it goes to obesity and all these other and obviously obesity and insulin resistance are very complex diseases. I come at it from a geriatrician trained under one of the world-leading experts in protein metabolism. So my perspective is very geared towards that. So I appreciate my own biases. However, we cannot discount the fact that insulin resistance, skeletal muscle accounts for 40% of the body. My husband would joke and say it accounts for 50% of his. Mike, you're probably 55. But if insulin resistance, and it is well documented that skeletal muscle becomes insulin resistant. And arguably, potentially even insulin resistant before the liver, before other tissues. And it's the primary site for glucose disposal. So we need to treat that first. And that, and Gary Schulman and Kit Peterson, they did some of the really pivotal work. I don't know if you've seen some of their work. They're out of Yale, and this must have been at least 10 years ago. And they showed insulin resistance in healthy, quote, healthy, sedentary 18-year-olds. Wow. Before they were overweight. Like there was no issues with obesity. They were considered healthy, sedentary individuals. Meaning skeletal muscle insulin resistance can begin decades before we cannot manage the consequences of that. And that needs to be our target.
Right. Instead of just giving more insulin or SGLT2 inhibitors or whatever it is. Yeah.
But really just changing the conversation. Number one, getting better at testing skeletal muscle. And number two, recognizing early on that, when we have all these conversations about science, the question is, what can we do about it? So we talk about all this stuff and then what can you do? Number one, you have to be training. You have to have flux in that skeletal muscle, and you have to protect skeletal muscle at all costs. And don't be overweight.
Yeah. I love it. Getting back to poor muscle quality.
Yeah.
This, I think, you did talk about it in the fat flux and everything like that. I think this is a new concept for a lot of people unless they've read the research. And we look at conditions. You mentioned insulin resistance, PCOS, which is related to insulin resistance. There's so many conditions that are now characterized with poor muscle quality, whether it's mitochondrial dysfunction or like the fat flux that you mentioned.
Absolutely.
If someone is worried I'm overweight, I'm insulin resistant, suffice it to say that your muscle quality is probably not so good?
I have thought about this often, and I would say yes. Again, it's difficult to say, okay, you absolutely, but likely yes.
Right.
And you're going to see, like you said, elevated levels of insulin, likely at some point, elevated levels of glucose, elevated levels of triglycerides. Also, you're not going to be strong. There's this concept that people will say, okay, well, individuals that are obese have more muscle mass. That says nothing about the quality. And not only that, again, and I think a lot about muscle. You can be deconditioned, increase strength 100 to 200%, right? So let's say someone is lifting 5 pounds and now they're lifting 10 or they're lifting 20. The incremental change in actual muscle mass is very small, right? So these are and I say that because these are very complex topics. So you can improve strength, but again, where are we starting from? And it takes a lot to actually build muscle.
This, I think, I get a lot of DMs. I know you do too. But a lot of people will say, I started weightlifting and I haven't lost weight or I haven't done this, but they're stronger. And so in their mind, they're thinking they're not making progress because they're not putting on muscle. But as you just said, strength precedes hypertrophy. Mm-hmm. So I think it's good for people to, even if, they're new to weightlifting, to not focus so much on just okay, I'm putting on, maybe my muscles don't look different, but I'm getting stronger.
Right.
That's a really good proxy because strength, and we can talk about all the studies with hand grip strength and longevity and the associations with poor hand grip strength and all-cause mortality. But strength is a really important proxy. And so what you're saying, what I heard you say is this is linked with muscle quality. Yeah. If you're getting stronger, you're making iterative progress.
I would say that I absolutely would say that what you're saying is correct. I would agree with that. And you're also improving this flux. So you're actually not getting stasis. The nutrients, the chemicals are not just sitting there. I say chemicals, but what we're talking about, fatty acids. It's not just sitting there. The glycogen isn't just sitting there, and I think that that's really important.
Good. So for folks that are having a hard time building muscle, then think hey, at least I'm getting stronger. Yeah. And then over time,
irrespective of weight loss, when individuals start exercising, they can improve triglycerides and HDL, irrespective of weight loss. Mm-hmm. That's amazing. There is this exercise factor that I think is not even being touched yet. Again, this is some of the earlier work of Pedersen, and I think she's in Copenhagen now. But this muscle as an endocrine system is completely missed in the majority of the context of what we're talking about for aging and longevity and wellness, right? So muscle as an endocrine system, when you contract it, it releases these myokines, which we've talked about. But what's so interesting about myokines, and the reason I'm saying this is because if someone is getting depressed or feeling hey, I'm really putting in the work and I'm not changing my body composition. Body composition is one thing. Looking good in a bikini is great. Physical performance as it relates to athletics is also great. From a medical perspective, when you are exercising, you are doing multiple things with skeletal muscle, leveraging the only organ system that you have voluntary control over. I mean, I guess you can breathe, but the lungs do a lot of other stuff that you have no control over. Skeletal muscle is under voluntary control. This is a whole organ system that is under voluntary control. So what are you going to do with it? Number one, when you are training, again, we talked about the flux. We talked about increasing strength. The contractile element of skeletal muscle is extremely interesting. And does that become important? Because as skeletal muscle, and there's 300 or more different myokines, and they all do different things. As these myokines are released into circulation, they partition the way your food is used, meaning they partition the way carbohydrates and fat are used. They interact with the immune system. You know, everyone is concerned about their immune system and upregulation of their immune system. Well, exercise, when these interleukins are released, you know, essentially cytokines, which are called myokines, actually can counterbalance inflammatory cytokines released from other variations of the immune system.
So I love this, and the context gets lost here, and I think it's really important. So if we think of like interleukin-6 being released from like macrophages or something,
it's inflammatory. That's inflammatory.
It's bad, but when you exercise, what happens?
It also releases interleukin-6 without a robust increase in TNF-alpha. And people must understand that. You're laughing, but yeah. Have you said this before?
No, I haven't talked about it, but I've read about it, but it's better if you talk about it.
Yeah. You know, we played around with testing this in the clinic. And, you know, we're still kind of playing around looking at interleukin-6 as it relates to clinic. And actually, they will end up being lower. So you get this acute response, and then interleukin-6 ends up being lower. So it's not a more floating around. It's actually less.
I love that.
Yeah, so it's just really interesting, this concept of myokines and where that's going to go as it relates to fitting into, again, medicine. I am not a fitness expert. I am purely looking at how do we take the best care of people, give them and provide them with the best knowledge so that they can be in control of their health, right? How is their trajectory of aging? And, you know, I don't want to circle back, but I kind of want to circle back. People will talk about longevity and that we should reduce dietary protein for, quote, this longevity aspect. Do you know what longevity is?
I don't know how I would care. I mean, I'm sure I could make something up, but I don't know how
It's like a trick question.
It. Yeah.
So you can definitely say no, because that is I'm trying to lead you to it, because I can't tell you.
Yeah.
So when individuals are making the argument, okay, well, this is a factor that's affecting longevity, then you better tell me, is this 6 hours? Or are we talking 6 weeks? So let's say there is something to chronic overstimulation of mTOR, whether it's from dietary protein, whether it's from, you pick your poison. You still need to be able to answer the question, longevity defined as what? And I think that becomes, because again, I'm a trained geriatrician, meaning I take care of or have specialized in individuals over the age of 65. That was part of my clinical responsibilities as a fellow. I did nutritional science, obesity medicine, which people don't think they're related. It's all related, and geriatrics. And I tell you, that end of life is not pretty. And if you fall and you break a hip, something else that's really important that I think is not discussed, that I think that muscle mass and the data would support muscle mass is more important than bone quality. That's crazy. Mm-hmm. Most individuals that age are going to get osteoporosis. There's nothing that you can do about it. I mean, yes, okay, so I say that lightly, but bone quality, let me reframe this in a different way. Bone quality is going to decrease no matter what you do. Let's say you train and you eat protein and you're out in the sun and you're getting vitamin D, K2, all these things, right? And you're on a vibration plate and who knows what, and you're not going to the moon. Your bone quality will decrease. Your muscle mass, you have direct control over that. You have much more capacity to input that. And if, again, muscle mass, I think, is more important. And also is going to, I don't want to say, indicate that if you fall and break a hip, you're going to have a problem. But actually, muscle mass is more important in fracture risk than bone quality. Mm-hmm. Muscle mass is more important in fracture risk than bone quality. That's crazy.
Very important. Yeah. Because these drugs are expensive, they have side effects. But I think, and then if we could drill down mechanistically, I've seen a lot more about osteosarcopenic obesity. So you mentioned sarcopenia and this coalescence. So you mentioned the 18-year-old otherwise healthy kids that actually have insulin resistance in their muscle. What people don't realize is that insulin resistance is linked with, and loss of muscle is linked with accelerated degradation of bone.
Totally.
Like this is
Yes.
part of the same triad that
Yes.
we've been talking about.
Yes.
And that's why it's important for people to conceptualize, okay, it's not so much about losing fat, it's about building and maintaining muscle and muscle quality.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Sarcopenic obesity is a problem. And sarcopenic obesity is the combination of low muscle mass and strength and then obesity. I mean, that just sounds like a disaster waiting to happen.
Right.
But
it's prevalent. I mean, I can't remember
and it starts way earlier. So sarcopenia is, typically defined as aging individuals, right? You're talking about 65 and up. Sarcopenia, if we look at the definition and we say decreased muscle mass and function, you're talking about individuals in their 30s.
If you could enumerate that.
Yeah.
20%, 30%. I mean, people that I've worked with, probably 30, 40%, I would say, like under 60. And then over 60, probably a majority of people are under-muscled. So
I would say the majority of all, I would say yes. I would say easily we can take those that are in the obesity. So is that 40% of the population? Then we already know 40% of the population. Again, we're speaking about this in very black and white terms, and they're certainly not. But I don't know, maybe you could say 40% of the population is actually under-muscled.
Wow.
And the issue is we're still treating symptomology and we're still focused on symptomology, and that's a problem. Especially when you think about all the things that input into insulin resistance, and I was, think about muscle. I think about like muscle as a suitcase and all these kind of inputs that affect its capacity, whether it's insulin resistance, whether it's, increase in inflammation, systemic inflammation, right? Because, when there's systemic inflammation, it affects muscle and muscle becomes more insulin resistant. You think about decreased mitochondria, which goes along with the listener cares about that because it decreases energy, decreases energy utilization, increase in fatigue.
All these things. For clinical biomarkers, for people that just run like a Chem24 or CBC differential, I think of like liver enzymes, just associations with insulin resistance as a way to maybe triangulate. How would you conceptualize that?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I always look at is I obviously look at fasting insulin and fasting glucose. I also look at, and by the way, individuals that are on a higher protein diet, their glucose tends to run a little bit higher. And could that be because of the generation of the body's own glucose, like gluconeogenesis? Possibly. Sometimes we do see higher levels of cortisol. I don't know the reason as to why. But typically their A1Cs are, and maybe the red blood cells live longer. The A1Cs, though, are typically all within range. And when I think about that and then fasting insulin and then triglycerides should be less than 100. And of course, liver enzymes, should be, if you are an athlete or if you are someone that trains, you will have higher liver enzymes.
And higher creatinine too.
Yep.
Which scares people.
Absolutely. So that's great. So if you're going to get a creatinine and GFR for kidney function and you are heavily muscled, you should get a cystatin C and get a corrected GFR.
Okay. I don't know that. What is that?
So it's a marker that the urologists use or the nephrologists use to get a corrected kidney filtration rate.
I see. Okay. And that's probably something you could just check off. Like it's not like an esoteric test that people need to.
No, not at all.
Okay.
Not at all.
That's really good. It's interesting, the framework, like when people are healthy, their lipids or their blood looks so different compared to people who are unmetabolically. And then the context matters. Like I've had one client who did an exercise session, like a HIIT session, went and got a standard lipid test, and the LDL cholesterol was 400. And the creatinine was, I want to say it was like close to 2. And so the lab actually called and said, hey, what's going on with this patient? And it was like, oh, client. And well, they just actually did a HIIT training session before. So I think context really matters. Not to deviate too much, but this is just a sidebar with lipids. There's this whole talk about lipid load testing and looking at non-fasted lipids?
Yeah, I think it's great conceptually. I don't do it, but I do think that it's great. So basically, people are saying that it doesn't matter what your fasting lipids are, it matters what your challenged lipids are. For me, I don't do it. I'm much more interested in ApoB. I'm much more interested in Lp(a), and I'm much more interested in more advanced testing, like the Clearly test that looks at hard and soft plaque and looks, or an endopat or a CIMT. I think that just like looking at muscle mass, body fat percentage, if you are looking at blood work that is solely blood work without looking at the heart or the arteries, you're missing it.
Great point. This is another question I want to ask you, because what is the heart? It's a muscle.
Yeah.
So when we think about, heart disease kills more people than COVID and all these other things, you see all these people, they're overweight, under muscled. And why would we assume that their heart, which is a muscle, would be healthy? And I know the coronary arteries can get occluded and all that. But how do you think about that heart disease from a muscle centric standpoint? Like, exercise is so good for the heart muscle and everything. Walk us through that.
Well, I have a cardiologist on staff at my practice, and he has his own practice, Dr. Twyman. So I am definitely not a cardiologist. However, I will say that when I think about cardiovascular activity and the heart, I do, people get, or cardiovascular activity has been getting a bad rap. True or not true?
True.
Everyone's like, don't do cardio, you need to do, and I think that there's benefit to it. I do think that zone 2 training is very beneficial. And I know that some people may disagree, and that's perfectly fine. But there is a component of mitochondria efficiency and really keeping that mitochondria healthy and mitochondria density. And the data would support that in chronic exercisers, even in older chronic exercises, that their mitochondria actually looks the same as a 30-year-old. And that's obviously not a heart biopsy. These are muscle biopsies. But you would assume that if you're improving mitochondria density in skeletal muscle, that, in order to leverage that and get there, you are probably improving cardiovascular tissue.
Makes a lot of sense. So speaking of that, what sort of training, I want to get to some of your specifics, like what you're doing. We were talking offline, you're having a lot more carbs now. What does your training look like? How many days a week? What's the frequency and cadence?
So for me, I always think, okay, am I... like what's happening in my life. I obviously just wrote a book. I have 2 very little kids. So I was focusing on strength, and I was doing 3 days a week of heavy lifting, mostly heavy lower body training.
Nice.
Not a ton of upper body because, I just seem to maintain being fit there, doing lots of push-ups with my kids on my back, but nothing crazy. And then 1 day a week of some kind of interval training. And whether it's high intensity or sprint interval training, it's one or the other. And then I will add in some cardiovascular activity.
Like as to cap off that exercise session, or throughout the week?
Throughout the week, separate. Throughout the week, separate.
Yeah.
But I'm really interested in changing it up. I'm just getting to the point where I'm super bored, so I'll probably do more metabolic conditioning because I enjoy it.
It's fun for you.
It's fun.
Do you think that's an important aspect for making this a habit for people? I mean, people see CrossFit and then they're like, oh, maybe I should do this because it's popular, or because the person that I follow on Instagram does it. But I always encourage clients, like, hey, if you like yoga, fine, do yoga, but also lift weights.
You have to lift weights.
Yeah.
And I don't think that there's a replacement for that. And there's a lot of discussion in this space. Is it strength or is it hypertrophy? And there's a continuum. When you train for strength, will you get some hypertrophy? Yes. When you train for hypertrophy, will you get some strength? Yes. Both are really valuable, and I think it depends on what season you're in. I do believe that you should, and I was just talking to, do you know Dr. Samuel Buckner? He's amazing, and he's another one of these more quiet scientists who are not totally out in the public, like banging their chest, which I love about them because they're usually really great scientists. And, we were talking about muscle hypertrophy, and the question is, I asked him, I said, well, do you think it's really important for muscle hypertrophy so that you increase the storage capacity of muscle? So basically, you and I were talking from the beginning, how do we allow ourselves to be the healthiest we can? And number one, we are in an environment that's hyperpalatable, and where do we do, or even if you're not, what do we do with these calories? Those carbohydrates, that stuff goes to muscle. It would make it would just make sense, to increase that storage capacity. And I said to him, so what do you think about that concept? And he's like, well, conceptually that makes sense, but you will always have to continue on. Once you reach a certain age, post-puberty, the gains that you make are actually very small. And not only that, you have to continuously train in that way to maintain that tissue, which I still think is really valuable.
Right. Yeah. And so progressive overload principles.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. But there's this perception, and I think thankfully it's changing, that weightlifting will turn women into these mass monsters and things like that. I wish. No. So can you help our female audience better understand that is there any merit to that conversation? Where did that come from?
I don't know. Yeah. I think that it probably comes from the time of the bodybuilders, where you're seeing them doing, lifting, and somehow that translates over. Women can gain muscle mass typically half the rate, and it's very difficult.
Does that change with menopause as well?
It's a great question. I personally I struggle with this. I struggle with this question because I would assume yes, because of the declining hormones, but that's not always the case. I do see women that are very focused on training and are very disciplined in their capacity, and I don't see them have body composition changes.
Mm-hmm. I would say that, I echo that. If they're physically fit going into menopause, and then, or what happens, I've seen with clients, is they wait until menopause. They have a lot of issues, sleep issues, hot flashes in this, and then they want to make lifestyle changes.
Right.
But I think having that base, that foundation earlier on, I think is very helpful.
100%. And there's a lot of discussion on hormones. Will these hormones change? Will they change the outcome of menopause? Nobody is giving, typically the standard of care is you're not giving hormones to adjust body composition. I mean, it's just not the standard of care. So you're not giving someone estrogen and assuming that her body composition is going to change. I'm not saying it does or it doesn't, but, typically the modalities are exercise and diet.
Mm-hmm. Since you mentioned hormones, I have a controversial question.
Oh, I love controversial questions.
There's a big push. You two may not like that. There's a big push to give gonadotropin receptor blockers to children who have ambiguous gender identity. And the people promoting this say it's reversible. Like if you give a kid a puberty blocker and they decide that they want to continue on with
So they're giving a puberty blocker. Help me set this. I'm not familiar with this. They're giving a puberty blocker to allow for a child to...
as they're deciding on their identified gender, and it's under the sort of the assumption is like, well, if you remove the puberty blocker, puberty will resume after you administer this. And to me, I think that's crazy.
I've never heard. So I've been a physician since 2006. I have never, and a fellowship trained physician, I have never heard medicine stepping in that way. I think that is, behaviors like that begin to play with fire.
I agree.
I mean, that is, your job is to not do harm as a physician.
Yeah. It's crazy. Yeah, there's a lot of gender affirming care workshops for doctors, and I've looked at some of the PDFs and so forth. And so this is, I think maybe it's on the fringe right now, but I think this is, being, doctors are being encouraged to learn more about this and to be able to utilize this in their practice. So I wanted to ask you about that. Yeah,
that will not be happening in my practice.
Right. Good. You mentioned you train legs 3 days a week.
I do.
So there was
that's because they're so scrawny, but yeah.
Oh, it's awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the thing about the legs that there's difference within the regions in the body of the muscle. And I would love for you to speak on that, because I think a lot of people sort of neglect, especially men neglect their legs. They work on upper body.
You mean Monday's Universal Chest Day?
Every gym, anywhere. It's crazy. Like even in Canada or like wherever.
Yeah.
So can we talk about why is it that the musculature in the legs become insulin resistant first?
That's a great question. I am going to guess and say that it's likely due to mass. That would be my... Again, because the fiber types are all different, but I'm assuming, it's likely due to mass. Do you have an answer? Because I don't know.
I think
know. Yeah.
I mean, Ben Bickman and I talked about it. He thinks it could be related to use, meaning that humans were sort of evolved, or natural selection geared us towards moving our legs a lot to go out and hunt, forage, and gather, and everything like that. And since we're not moving as much, they might they've just been adapted to that movement, and so therefore that might be why they become insulin resistant first.
That's interesting. I would think that we are moving our legs more than we're moving our upper body, especially, to me, I would say if I were to think about it that way, then it would be the non-dominant hand that would become insulin resistant first. But because you've got to get up to go to the bathroom and all the things.
Around. Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, let's finish up on some carbonutrients and carbs. So you talked about creatine loading and looking at the creatinine levels as a test. That's
and again, this is new. I haven't instituted it yet. I don't even know if it's going to be available. But there is some promise there in looking at as a marker for skeletal muscle mass.
Are you taking creatine?
Not right now, no.
Okay.
But I think it's great. So I think so if I were to recommend supplements, I would recommend creatine. I would recommend vitamin D. I'd recommend fish oil. I'm really big into urolithin A. Have you heard of mTOR?
I've heard of it. Tell us about it.
So I'm really interested in urolithin A. I think that it is a compound that 40% of individuals don't make, and it's like a prebiotic, but it basically can come from these can come from walnuts, raspberries, pomegranates, and it impacts mitochondria. It impacts the turnover of mitochondria.
Okay.
And there's multiple ways in which it impacted, but there's some really good data, at least promising data so far. So I've been really big into this lately.
Yeah. I met with those guys, the people that represent that company, and they said, well, you have to take it for 90 days before you notice anything. But you said 40% of people have a defect in
or just they don't have the genetic capacity to make urolithin A.
Wow. So that's on your must-have list, along with vitamin D.
Yeah, lately I'm very
That's
into
cool.
it, yes. And it's really hard for me to get excited about something. I never was super excited about resveratrol. I mean, it's okay because, we did some of that work, a lot of labs do. And listen, there's great promise, but I think that you have to pick and choose.
Well, it's so expensive. It's like $120 a month. I mean, you could get a lot of vitamin D, fish oil, and ribeye steaks for that.
Lots of steaks, yep.
So you don't take creatine, but do you recommend, or not right now?
No,
right.
I do. I do recommend creatine. I think creatine is great for brain function, and especially individuals who are steering away from red meat. They should definitely, I think obviously check with your physician, but creatine is wonderful. And it's above and beyond exercise fatigue.
Right. Brain health and
Totally.
all this. Okay. If there's a vegan or vegetarian who's still listening up to this point of our conversation,
Yeah, they haven't turned us off.
what are some must-haves that they should include? Because they're
branched chain amino acids. This is the point, to use a branched chain or an essential amino acid with a meal. So we talked about chronic stimulation of mTOR. That is one of the reasons why you shouldn't be, snack. I think snacking is a bad idea. And also, snacking, it's not the snacking in and of itself. It's the, what are you pushing forward? Like what are the pathways that you're pushing forward? So if you are vegan or vegetarian with your lower protein meal, you can add in a scoop of branched chains, or you can add in a scoop of creatine and branched chains to like 3 ounces of fish, or your soy burger. Yeah.
I love it. Now, clinically, I know we might rub some toes here or irritate some people, but have you seen people that have done vegan right and have been able to maintain their strength and muscle mass throughout lifespan? Do you think there's a subset of the population who that works for?
Yeah.
Is it ideal, optimal?
So I have thought a lot about that. And I had one friend, has been vegan for a very long time. And up until, I would say she's now in her 50s. I would say she was able to thrive on a vegan diet, and I'm just not seeing it anymore. That being said, also my patient population is not particularly vegan. Could an individual thrive in that way? I think there is a subset of the population that has the potential to be optimized on a more vegan vegetarian diet. And I'm going to tell you the mechanism of why I think. Okay. And I think that that's related to the gut microbiome. There's some evidence to suggest that depending on an individual's gut microbiome, that those bacteria can scavenge and actually get essential amino acids from the bacteria.
Interesting.
And but is that for how long they can do it? Is this an 8-week thing? I don't know. What is that thing? What do we think about that in terms of optimizing muscle? I think that is a risky way to go, but can it be done? And for some people, I think that, again, it really depends on the makeup of the person, and we just don't know enough about it. But I think it has to do with the gut microbiome. Like
maybe East Asian people, something from India, whatever. Yeah.
Maybe 2% or less of the population. I mean, we typically don't see individuals thrive in that way.
Right.
It just becomes difficult, right? As individuals age, the fiber content with the protein, right? It binds it. It's not as bioavailable. The other aspect is the quality. Zinc, iron. Again, I've taken care of older patients. They're not wanting to consume more. You're lucky you're getting one meal in them.
Right. Which was what I was going to ask you next, is about bolus dosing versus, there's that whole nibbling versus gorging study. And there's one related study to that where they had elderly women consume, it was like 1 or 2 meals, all of their protein recommendations, and then had younger women consume like 3 or 4 meals and space it out. So is that bolus dose, do you generally recommend? Because we've talked about that before.
And actually, since the last time we spoke, I've changed my positioning on what that looks like. And I would say that first meal of the day is the most important. I was talking, do you know Katie Holmes?
I've heard the name.
She's amazing. She's one of the senior scientists at Whoop. And we were talking about this circadian eating pattern. And typically I would say it doesn't, so I may change my tune on this. I typically say it doesn't matter when you have your first meal. I may be rethinking that. I may think that the first meal of the day that you should be feeding within, the earlier waking hours and potentially stopping as the sun goes down, potentially. That being said, the first meal of the day, whenever at this point you eat it, should be, I don't want to say highest in protein, but it should be very robust, between 30 to 50 grams, if not higher. Why? Because you are now in a catabolic state. You are coming up after an overnight fast. Your body is primed. And this would be the time to really hit a robust amount. And really, we know that the minimum amount to stimulate muscle protein synthesis is about 30 grams. Younger if someone is younger, or less if someone is younger. But a more optimal range is likely closer to 50. And that first meal of the day, is really important. And then the second meal, we don't actually know how long muscle protein synthesis and mTOR is stimulated. We don't actually know. It could be 5 hours. It could be 6. We don't actually know. So that second meal may be less important. And then that third meal, that last meal before, let's say you're doing, or whatever it is, but your last meal before you're going into an overnight fast.
Sufficient protein.
And, from my perspective, it's 50 grams, maybe even a little higher, I dare say.
But how many people are actually doing this, right? I mean, most people are fasting all day. They'll have a salad at lunch with a little chicken. And for dinner, it might be another salad and like a little tuna or whatever.
Yeah.
So not many people are hitting these targets. So that's one point. The other thing is the quality of the protein. I'm a big fan of red meat.
Yeah.
I've had chickens and turkeys and all that. And just seeing how, they eat grain, right? Whereas the ruminants are eating grass, which is nice. How do you steer people away? If they like chicken, fine.
Yeah. I just don't, I don't steer people away. I certainly think that the red meats and the ruminants are more nutrient dense. And they're also upcyclers. They take marginal land, which we can do nothing with. We can't even grow anything. And they upcycle it to nutrients that are highly bioavailable for human consumption. And the fact that we get to choose to eat it is a luxury.
Right. This is true. But there's a big push to influence people to not eat that because of climate change and these things. And I love that you've been talking a lot about this on your podcast and interviewing people that are actually studying this because there's a lot of activists out there who don't understand exactly
the mouse with the microphone. So, we cannot eat our way out of climate change. It's not going to happen. So the question is, why are we even still talking about it?
It's hard to disentangle now politics from science, which is sad. It's become one and the same.
Yeah, it is sad. Yeah, no, go ahead. I totally agree with you. I think that this idea that we can eat our way out of climate change and the concept of Meatless Monday, and if people are interested, they can listen to my podcast with Frank Mitlerner. And, people have tried to discredit him. This guy, he doesn't care what the answer is. He just wants to know what the answer is. Climate change is a population-based issue. Climate change is industry, electricity, and transportation. And if you care about that, fine. And you live in Minnesota, then, I don't know, don't eat your avocados, whatever it is.
Right.
But you're not going to eat your way out of climate change.
Yeah. That is the paradox, right? Where people say, I'm going vegan for the environment. And then you look at their porch, there's Amazon boxes piled up. And
absolutely.
You're like, okay, well, if you look at like the greenhouse gases created to deliver that from China and then same day deliver all these things, you're like, well, it's kind of hypocritical. And so I don't think people are thinking through these things. They just hear sound bites.
Do you think they're not thinking through it? What do you think
I'm trying to understand it myself.
What do you think the issue is? Because
I think it's just, a lot of people get their information from NPR and CNN and these mainstream, and it's like there's an agenda now, post-COVID about, pushing the environment is the big agenda. And I think a lot of people feel as though they're making a big difference by having the Beyond Meat burger instead. Like, I'm making a major difference. But talk about unsustainability of using, these commercial crops and so forth to bring these burgers that still need to be refrigerated. And I don't know. It's interesting, but I love how you're enumerating the actual differences. Like if everyone in America has a Meatless Monday, the delta in greenhouse gases is 0.6%.
Yeah, and you would have to be vegan for 2 years to balance out one transatlantic flight. What I think is really interesting is that there is creating this huge division. And that's nonsense. Whatever these climate change, be vegan, eat meat because of the environment, while all a while, right, behind the, curtain, these guys are like, these people are so stupid. Yeah. I cannot, you're talking about big industry. Talking about big industry creating massive issues with climate change. Not whether you're eating Beyond, like, first of all, and I don't even know who owns the technology for Beyond Burger, right? So who stands to profit? But the fact that people are buying into this argument is surprising. And it creates division. If you don't want to eat meat because you like, Morris the cow, fine. But if you are saying it's because of health reasons, or you are saying it's because of climate change, then I think that there needs to be a re-education, and also understanding that we are not here to be divided.
Right. That doesn't solve problems. It just
No,
creates
it
more.
is a complete smokescreen.
So I've heard you ask many guests this very question, so I would like to ask you, why do you think there's this big push? Is it because people stand to benefit from creating these novel plant-based products, and it's a new industry?
You know what I really think?
Okay.
I think it's distraction. I think while it's almost like if you take a ball for a puppy and you throw it. That's what I think is happening. I'm not sure that anyone is caring so much about our health. I think that it is being utilized as a distraction, because if we're arguing here about things that are like ridiculous, then we're going to turn a blind eye to the things that we can change.
Well, a lot of people are not thinking that high level about these issues, so I appreciate that. So when does the book come out?
September.
Amazing. Cool. What's it called?
Forever Strong.
Love it. Okay.
And it's going to be about these very concepts about muscle and nutrition for health at any age. And really, I have to say, it kind of goes against what the current longevity narrative is.
And are you putting your neck out there a little bit by putting out this content in a way? Like,
I mean, I don't know. How long have I been talking about this?
A long time.
How long have we know? I mean,
Yeah.
It's been at least 7 years.
Yeah.
Where
Right.
nobody would listen to anything that I was saying. I mean, I don't know if that's
No,
entirely true.
tons of people. No, tons
like,
of
but
people
back
listen. Yeah.
in the beginning when I was talking about these concepts, I think people were uninterested in sarcopenia and uninterested in muscle health, except as it relates to fitness potential. And that's totally missing the mark. So am I sticking my neck out? I don't know, because it's all I've ever done.
Good for you. Now, when is the pre-sale going to happen?
February.
Oh, cool. All right. So shortly
Yeah, I'm
after
excited.
this launches. Yeah.
I'm excited. It's been a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's finish up on a few personal things. So you have young kids at home.
I do.
It's important for them to get protein, not, Lego, Eggo, waffles and Pop-Tarts. A lot of people feed their kids that. I know with my daughter, she's picky, so she likes lamb. Sometimes she likes eggs, sometimes not.
Yeah.
What have you found as a good protein source for parents for kids?
So ground beef is great. My kids love ground beef, and then you can put things in it. So ground beef, you can hide liver in it. My kids love steak, and they like chicken, they like eggs. They actually eat a lot of dairy, so they like a lot of goat type dairy. Nice. And then they love berries too.
Cool.
And also the other thing is we never really exposed them to the stuff.
To junk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I do travel quite a bit, and when I came home, are you ready for this? There were frosted mini wheats in my cupboard.
Goodness. Did you have a meltdown?
I did. She's like, oh my God.
I get these
what's
out of
wrong
here.
with it? Frosted mini wheats, honey bunches, like this stuff. I'm like, the kids will never see this.
Yeah.
So I was the crazy person with the bag and like the pajamas and the big fluffy boots going outside, throwing out this bag. But
Right.
yeah.
Well, it's hard. I mean, especially it's very important to entrain your children early on, because they develop a palate for these hyperpalatable foods, and that's a harder habit to break. So I love that.
Yeah,
dedication.
and not to go off on a sidebar, because I feel like we're probably finishing up. One of the things that is very interesting is that there's a natural strength that develops when children are still growing. So you mentioned, like, could you block puberty? Well, muscle development is critical during that time. And once that time is over, that's their period to develop this, quote, natural strength, which means, like, you could probably be totally not trained and go on the bench press, and you're going to be able to do a certain standard amount of weight, right? And that is probably much higher than, say, someone who in their adolescent never trained. And that's called natural strength. And that natural strength, typically, once that puberty is over, that is not, that's it.
Right. So it's important to keep your kids active.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
They should be doing push-ups. No, but truly, like, now we've got the iPad and people are completely zoned out, and, you're taking away their ability to build up that natural strength. And I think that that's really important, because kind of as that window closes, that's who they are now for the rest of adulthood. Yes, you can get stronger, but the natural strength is something different.
Yeah, and why would you want to deprive your child of that? They may or may not become an athlete, but at least they'll have that foundation.
It has nothing to do with that. Yep.
It's scary. Like, my daughter's 10 and at the school, there's kids with iPhones, and it's not just that one kid has the phone, it's that they're all attracted to it. So I've seen kids at the park playing, and one kid comes up with a phone, and it's like they all just circle around it and they stop playing. And to me, that's very sad.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother, like, for a long time, as parents, all we had to deal with was the food. And like maybe back now we have phones, food, we have all sorts of stuff.
No, it's crazy.
There's a lot of things, as a parent now, you got to like navigate around.
I agree.
It's tough. Gabrielle, I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing such great info. So your podcast is available on iTunes and everywhere?
The Dr. Gabrielle Lyon Show. Super cheesy name, but I only do that so people can find me.
Yeah.
They can find me on my website, and I see patients all over the world. Actually, everything is remote, and we have a whole team of providers.
That's awesome.
Which is amazing. And if people are interested, they can sign up for my newsletter on my website, and I'm very active on Instagram and Twitter and YouTube, actually.
Awesome.
And pretty much everywhere that you can find social media.
Yeah, you're out there putting out good content. So thank you.
Meaningful content, I hope.
Oh yeah, no, it gets a lot of engagement. I love like the memes when you're picking on protein.
It's so funny. You just like post it, and people are like, you're not supposed to post it and like leave it. But I don't really actually spend much time on Instagram, because then it takes away from me being able to read and actually, keep an eye, right? Because the time is finite, and
it's all we have. Yeah.
So
it's important. I think that's the biggest challenge. Like we have so much access to technology and information. Yeah. But our biggest challenge is how to cull our attention back from all the distractions.
Totally.
And actually focus. Like, you got books behind you. There's all this stuff in PubMed. I just turn my phone off during the day, and then I'll check in a little bit and turn it off. I don't know, like little batches.
I hide it. I don't even know where it is.
That's awesome. That's the best strategy.
Yeah.
Well, appreciate you coming on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.